Welcome to episode 534 of the Brainy Business, understanding the psychology of why people buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Andy Luttrell. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. Have you ever stopped to think about why you believe the things you do, or what it really takes to change your mind, or someone else's? Whether we're talking about politics, pineapple on pizza, or that brand you swear by, our opinions shape how we move through the world. That is exactly why I wanted to bring back this insightful conversation with Dr. Andy Luttrell. As a social psychologist who specializes in attitudes and persuasion, Andy unpacks the science behind how opinions are formed, why some stick more than others, and what it takes to truly shift someone's perspective. We're revisiting this now because it ties beautifully into Thursday's episode with Laurier Mandan, author of I Need That, a book about how brands create desire and meaning in people's lives. Understanding how opinions are formed, after all, is just as important for individual growth and mindset as it is for marketing and branding. When we understand what makes an opinion feel strong or weak, or deeply held versus fleeting, we can be more thoughtful in how we influence others and ourselves. As you listen today, I invite you to consider what opinions in your life feel unshakable, and why might that be? And is it serving you well? Really quickly, before we get into the conversation, I want to be sure you know that there are links in the show notes for my top related past episodes and books, ways to get in touch, and more. It's all within the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/534. Now let's jump right in. Dr. Andy Luttrell, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, super excited. So we got connected as, quote, fellow psych nerds, I believe was the title from our mutual friend, Kwame Christian. And he said, hey, you two got to have a convo, right? You got to chat. And because you're part of this greater Columbus, Ohio contingent with Brian Ahern and Kwame and many others that I have been introduced to over the years, just super excited. And like any friend of any of them is a friend of mine. So it's
perfect.
We'll have a chat. But tell the listeners a little bit about you and what has your psych nerddom is built upon.
Sure. Yeah. So I identify as a social psychologist. So I got my PhD in social psychology in 2016 and am currently an assistant professor of psychological science at Ball State University. And the research that I do in that world has to do with what we call attitudes and persuasion. So I like to just easily refer to that as opinions and when they change. So our attitudes are things like our consumer attitudes, which might be of most interest to listeners, right? Like my attitude toward a product or a service or a particular person that I have some sort of ongoing relationship with. But, as far as I'm concerned, the basics of that apply broadly. So that stuff about attitudes and when they change applies to our political views. They apply to our moral views. They apply to the views we have of ourselves, right? Self-esteem. What is it but an opinion we have of ourselves? So that's sort of the background of what I do, and have always been interested in not only doing the original research, but sharing that research widely, because for decades and decades, social psychology has really been in the business of understanding the stuff that runs our everyday lives and people around the world, both for curiosity's sake, but also in ways that we could apply it and maybe strategically to accomplish some goal we have.
Yeah. So when you talk about opinions and it being opinions of ourselves, which I think in general, whether it's from a confirmation bias or status quo bias or what we get kind of ingrained in our own ways. So like how much of that is ever changing sort of thing? How much is static? Is there a way of really knowing some of that? What's guess? What do we know? What can we learn from that?
Yeah. So you mean the just attitudes and opinions in general, or specifically how we see ourselves?
Well, I was asking about specifically how we see ourselves based on the intro you gave,
Yes.
and
Yep.
would say answer it however you want.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, there's a few different interesting angles to take that with, but the part about how we see ourselves is probably actually where that work has been the strongest over time, I might say. So there's been a bunch of interest in whether our sense of self is this kind of like static, ever enduring quality of who we are, right? There's one me and it's always the me. And, cross-cultural psychology seems to show that that can be the case, but often is the case for more Western cultures. In other cultures, our view of ourself is ever changing. The metaphor is of a river, right? You don't ever dip your toe into the same river twice. It's always something different. So too, are we a different person from moment one to moment two? And so in some sense, right, the question of which is true, is it static or is it ever changing? I don't know. There's different ways to answer that question. What's more important is how we think about that question for ourselves, right? So some people, some cultures, some places prefer to think of themselves and whether they themselves are good or bad people as sort of a enduring trait of who they are. Other people or cultures or situations instead emphasize this ever-changing nature. And that has lots of implications for how we pursue goals, for how we try to talk to each other, right? Do we see the world as static and fixed, or do we see the world as constantly changing and evolving?
And so when you look at from a marketing or a brand perspective, so if you're at a company, do you just pick one and like you're going to appeal to either the people that think, I'm ever changing, or the people that are more static and that's what our brand is about? Or should you have separate messaging for both types, or something that might appeal to both, would you say?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have any work specifically on that, but there's definitely plenty of work showing that there is this conundrum of I have a diverse audience with a bunch of different ways that they prefer to see me and my product and my brand. And so I only get to give one message at a time. So what message should that be? And if I think that your audience has this, what the researchers call dialectical view of the world, which is to say that things are constantly changing. I can't depend on something being the same every time. They might be totally open to a brand that shifts strategies or images or approaches. And there is some cross-cultural advertising and marketing work that I think tends to show that in some places, people are totally cool with a brand doing a million different things, right? Like for Coca-Cola to come out with a line of socks would be fine, because I just care that this is a respected brand. Whereas, that's pretty unusual in the West, right? You go, well, no. I have a very specific idea of what you're supposed to do. And the second blue Pepsi turns its head and becomes a thing, I'm out. I can't abide anymore.
Yeah.
So I do think that the meta lesson of a lot of communication research is that your audience is going to have its own way that it prefers to navigate certain questions. And the way you present yourself, either your brand image or the messages that you communicate, ought to be aware of that audience's preference.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely link in the show notes. So my friend Will Leach, who also teaches at Texas A&M University with me in our certificate in applied behavioral economics, his book, Marketing to Mind States, he does talk about, how you pick kind of what side you're on and what the goal is someone's looking at. So it is related to the question that I was asking for those who are listening and very intrigued by that. But, if you pick a message for your brand, essentially to say, we want to be about this ever-changing growth. And I think if you look at something like health, right, you could go either way and say, we're going to appeal to the people who want to be ever growing and changing and not feeling stuck. And it's this journey of life message. And that's just going to appeal to someone very differently than, if you have people who feel like they're very stuck in their life and this is who I am and what I have to be, trying to force them out of that mindset or mind state, to use a term from Will, is going to be really difficult. But how might you message to them in that fixed spot and still get them to make a change? That's a different type of communication, and you just kind of pick what works for your brand and go with it. So anyway, you were talking about also, so like matching the message to, this was before we got into the conversation. So those who are listening and going, when did he say that? So when we were talking pre-call, having the message tailored to the recipient, and specifically that you've done some work with morals and when you want to use the kind of like right thing and when you want to avoid it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the genesis of that line of research really came out of this interesting question of how do people who moralize their views respond to persuasive attempts? Right? And there's lots of reason to think that if someone sees their stance as rooted in morality, they're just not going to budge, right? They're going to go, no, I already made up my mind. This is what's right. I decided. But, we realize that there's this approach to persuasion that talks about morality, right? Like, do the right thing. This is the right way to do it. When you think about how we talk about the environment, right? We say, this is your opportunity to reduce harm, to think about future generations. Like, these are moral appeals that we use. And there's this long history in psychology and communication research of showing that if the message matches the kind of opinion the audience already has, it's going to go further. So there was this interesting opportunity to look at, like, okay, sometimes people already see an issue through a moral lens. And so if I use a moral argument, are they going to be super resistant because they moralize it and they won't budge? Or are they going to be especially open because I'm talking about exactly the thing that they care about? And we, going into it, I had no idea. It's like, it could go either way. They could totally hate that we're trying to change an opinion that they see as morally relevant, or they go, oh, yeah, no one's ever talked about the moral side of the other position that you could take. And so that's what we find across a few different, to give one example, was recycling. So pretty much everybody is super positive toward recycling. And so we thought, what if we try to convince you that recycling is actually not ideal, right? It's not perfect. It doesn't do everything that you think it might do. I can either try to say recycling isn't great for moral reasons, right? It has these kind of maybe unethical side effects, or I could try to argue that it has these pragmatic issues. And so what we find is that when people had a moral pro-recycling stance, they were actually a little more open to the ethical arguments to oppose recycling because it matched, right? It talked directly to the reasons that were at the heart of this person's opinion to begin with. And so we've expanded that out a little bit, but the basic notion is that when we're trying to talk about these moral issues, sometimes we feel like we want to retreat from talking about that, but that's exactly the dimension that the audience cares about, right? And so if you make a moral issue all about saving money, people go, I don't care about saving money. I care about doing the right thing. And so if you keep trying to tell me that this is cheaper or more efficient, I just don't care. But if you can actually convince me that the ethics are not what I thought they were initially, that might be a stronger communication method.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense when, not to say it's something that I would have known going into the research, like you said, where you just sort of see what's going to happen. So knowing that plenty of people have their issues with Myers-Briggs, but there, that there's a, that thinking versus feeling conundrum, or, whichever side you come up on that dichotomy. And so being a thinking type myself, you hurt that person's feelings or that made them sad argument. It's like, well, but that's not relevant to this work issue at hand because something was done incorrectly or whatever. You go logic for those sorts of things. And so if someone has a logical argument that's better than where I started from, I'm more likely to appeal to it versus the emotional impact of something, because that is who I am. Whereas someone who is on the more feeling side, I can throw logic at them all day long. And perhaps it's ethics and morals, just to use what you're talking about here, and say logically, this is why this is unethical or whatever. But if they're all about emotion, it just isn't going to land well.
Totally. Yeah. And that's sort of some of the most matching research in persuasion is about this sort of logical emotional divide, right? Where there's this question of, well, what should I do? Are logical arguments the most persuasive, or are emotional arguments the most persuasive, right? Should I get you to feel your way to my side or reason your way to my side? And the answer is, well, neither of them are like the answer. It depends on who you're talking to, right? There are going to be people who either because of who they are and how they approach the world are more just have a preference for that kind of like thinking approach to things, and other people who really have a preference for emotional stuff. And even if it's not the person, right, there are some issues that I go, I don't care about the reasons, the like logical reasons for this. Like I do this because it feels good, right? Like if you try to convince me that your pizza is the most economical pizza, I don't care. I want it to taste good.
Right.
For pizza, I'm an emotional person.
Yeah.
Right. For other things, I'm a logical person. Right. And so, yes, there are individual personality types that can sort of underlie these things, but they're not perfect. Right. Like I'm not only a logical person, and most people aren't only an emotional person. There's also this nuance to it too that depends on what you're talking about.
Yes, because we are not robots.
Right. Most of us.
Which is why behavioral economics and the behavioral sciences are even existing, and why we have podcasts and talk about this, both of us. So yes. And I would love if we can expand on, I know I mentioned in that pre-conversation, I get quite a few questions that have to do with personality type. And if there are, if we're looking at these concepts of behavioral science to say, is someone more likely to be persuaded by loss aversion if they are X personality type or not? Or, if we know something, big five being one that comes up more often versus like a Myers-Briggs. But if you have a type of personality scale you like to look at or something, do you have any thoughts on, or, I guess background research is maybe more what we're looking on versus just specific thoughts, but that goes to help with understanding on those personality types and how that might align with some specific appeals that may be most useful when we're looking for persuasion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are all sorts of ways that personality variables could intercut with the persuasion process. So a lot of times in psychology, we'll use this term individual differences to mean sort of like basically personality. But when we hear personality, we think, extroversion and conscientiousness. But there are all sorts of things that are like traits of a person that aren't those kind of classic personality traits. And I think all of them can be relevant. So on one level, what these personality variables could do is determine just an overall openness to influence, right? So some people call it open-mindedness, call it, gullibility, call it any of these things. It could be like there are some people who are easy marks and other people who are not, right? So that's sort of the pessimistic way to look at it. And I don't know that it's that helpful because that's such a wide brush that you're painting with, but people have tried to do it, right? And they've even tried to do like intelligence, right? Like if you're smart, are you more persuadable? And again, it's like, I don't know that that's the right question, right? It's just, there will never be a satisfying answer to that question. What I think is more interesting is a level where you think about personality as determining how a person approaches the persuasion dynamic, right? And anyone has the potential to change their mind. We do, contrary to popular belief, people do change their minds about things. It might take some nudges in time, but it does happen. And so some of these personality variables can have something to do with just one's willingness to engage with certain ideas. So there's an individual difference variable that we study sometimes called the need for cognition. So some people are very high on need for cognition. Some people are very low, kind of like we were talking about before about logic and reason, right? Some people just love to think about stuff. And if you know people love to think about stuff, then you can go, oh, well, I can give you a message that really is like the strongest version of my argument, right? And if I know that you're going to love to pick this apart, I'm going to like give you the goods and like let you convince yourself based on my arguments that I've got something good to say. But some people go, oh God, I hate puzzles. I would never touch a crossword. I don't like to think at all. Then I go, okay, I'm not going to waste my time outlining the 16 reasons why what I have to say is worthwhile, right? Instead, I might use sort of flashier tactics, right? I might say, listen, most people agree experts agree this is just like the right answer to the question, right? And if you don't like to think very much, that is like the best strategy, right? Because you go, I'm still getting my message through, but I have to change my approach based on how you're going to process the information I give you. So those are the first two levels. And the third level, I think, is what are the kinds of arguments you do give people, right? And that's going to depend on personality as well. So classic Big Five type personality stuff, openness to experience and extroversion and conscientiousness. There is some research to show that, I could sell my product or idea framed in terms of the personality traits that define you best. And that's going to have more leverage, right? So like the one study that comes to mind is, this dates it a little bit, but it was an advertisement for a VCR. And it was like, I could sell this VCR by showing how it's going to make you the life of the party. People are going to come to your house. You're going to throw movies on, have karaoke. It's going to be wonderful. Or I say, this is a great VCR. If you just want a quiet night at home, watching some of the best movies that are available, this is the way to go. As you might be following, right? That's going to appeal differently to introverts and extroverts, right? So extroverts who get that first message are going to pay more attention. They're going to say, oh, this is actually, there's something to this. And introverts will prefer the other one. More recently, there was a big kind of Facebook-based study where they look at ads floating around Facebook, and they know, if I have my ad tailored toward extroverts, more extroverted Facebook users are going to click on that ad more often, right? So we know that just throwing a message out into the void is certainly one strategy. But if you can be a little nuanced about it, right, the personality of the person you're trying to influence is going to determine which message is going to be most impactful.
Well, and so looking at, like you're saying with the Facebook ads, I would assume in that if you did have messaging for both extroverts and introverts, or those who have a tendency towards extroversion, or, however we want to say that properly, but the introverted style potentially won't even really notice the ad that was targeted towards those that are more leaning towards extroversion. It's not going to make it through that subconscious filter. And so it's not like you're damaging that you could never appeal to them, but you just kind of know that when you're looking for a specific audience, you can kind of go a little bit further into appealing toward that personality type with the message that you're looking at. And ideally you can pick, if you're running ads on Facebook, they're one of those that lets you pick specific interests or things that can be pointing towards extroversion or introversion to help determine and see if it's going to be most appealing to the audience, where people aren't saying like, my Big Five personality is this. Like, people don't know. So if they can't tell you, how do you find them? Feel like is part of the problem as well, which, yeah.
Yeah, implementation wise, that's the thing. So I'm not, I'm just on the theory side of things. So
I was going to say, I'm guessing you don't have that answer, but.
Yeah, but it is, it's an important part of the equation. So the first thing you mentioned is maybe I just shotgun out all the versions of this possible, right? And it's going to land in the right places. What I don't think we know enough about is the possibility of backfire. And maybe personality is not one of those that will work, but think about like moral values or political values, right? If I'm framing something in terms of a very specific political audience and the wrong person comes across it, right? That might actually tarnish the image, right? Or backfire. Whereas, sure, an introvert who sees the VCR ad about having parties just goes, not for me. But then I come across a different one later and I go, oh, actually, maybe it is for me. Probably fine. I don't think we know where that line is, but intuitively it feels like there's a line somewhere where it actually could do more damage to mismatch or wrongly tailor to a particular person. And so that shotgun approach may not always pan out, depending on what kind of matching you're doing. Yeah,
definitely agree. I think, and political and all the things we try not to talk about too much in the religion and whatever. Right. You can get any of those topics, something can go wrong much more likely than it is to go the other way. So if you are working in a sensitive space, be aware. If you're selling candy bars, you're probably okay.
Right. Or at least if you're selling candy bars by matching to personality. If you're trying to politicize candy bars, also maybe not the way to go.
Right. Yeah. And What an interesting concept. We won't go down that particular rabbit hole.
I did think, oh yeah, I'd like to see what happens with that.
We'll do a research project soon.
Yes.
Where we'll see about the politics of candy someday here. That'll be good times. When you think about persuasion, what gets you excited? Like when you're teaching, maybe it's some of the classes that you teach or the areas of research that you're most interested in, like what do you look at these days that you think is just the most intriguing stuff out there?
What's cool about persuasion is it's, I think, one of the earliest topics of study in lots of the social sciences and social psychology in particular. Like a lot of that came out of kind of like the Second World War and the military being like, we need to gather up all the scientists to like figure out how to do some things. One of them being, how do we convince people to support this war effort? How do we increase morale? And so we really have like this foundational understanding of persuasion that goes back to the 40s because it was just by necessity. And it has branched out. What I think is so cool about persuasion is that I look at it from a psychology point of view, but there are people in marketing and business and communication and political science and sociology and all of these fields that are bringing their own sort of perspective to it, right? Because I think it's really at the heart of what we do every day, right? It doesn't feel like we're trying to constantly influence the people around us, but we are talking about our opinions almost all the time.
Right.
Like we can't help ourselves. If we have a view on something, right? Sure, sometimes there are fora where we go, okay, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. But if you go see a movie that you love, you go, I want to tell people about it. I want to recommend it to them. And that's a form of persuasion, right? I'm through a message that I'm conveying, I may end up changing someone's mind or influencing someone to do something. So I think that's what's so interesting about persuasion is it's really at the heart of so many things. It also means that it has been very well studied, which means like the question of like the new frontiers sometimes can feel like, wow, we've got a lot of it mapped out, but I don't think we have enough of it mapped out to know like with certainty, here's the strategy that will work in your setting, right? There's always going to be some growing pains of the application process. And some of our theories just maybe need to get a little tighter, right? Like in the wake of COVID stuff, everyone's like, how do we use messaging to increase compliance with health behaviors or to convince people to get a vaccine? And we're like, oh, actually, I don't have the perfect answer. Like we all could come up with a guess, but until we start to deploy these things, we don't actually know. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this work being done in the field, both for those kind of big public health related things, but also individual people implementing these things in their own businesses and marketing efforts. Your specific situation is a unique combination of factors that no one study has ever put together before. And I think we just need better tools to know like, okay, maybe how do we get a better sense of this before we start, or even devise a tool for applying these things to unique situations?
Yeah, I often talk about generalizability and its lack of existence. When we look into applied, when we're taking something like where you're on the theoretical side and you read this research paper and you go, oh my gosh, amazing. Like this is this, and it will always work. And go, well, no, probably not. But there's a lesson there. There's something to know when you create your own study within your business context or life context, but know that there were parameters in a lab or whatever it was. That study was done in Australia and you're in Japan, they're not necessarily going to be exactly the same. So sounds like we're thinking the same way on that.
Totally. Yeah. The way of thinking of that I like recently is to think about all the stuff about human behavior being multiply determined, right? So any one study can isolate a handful of factors,
right?
But just think about like, why did I have a breakfast taco this morning? Well, God, I don't know. There's like 3,000 things that led to that very, very specific decision. And there's no study out there, like I said, that has all 3,000 of those factors together. And so, yeah, anytime we're going to be like, well, I want to know how to get my friend to change his mind about this topic. You go, okay, well, there's a lot at play there. And we can have good guesses, better than nothing. But it's hard for me to say, it's not like physics where you go like, okay, this math equation will determine exactly how far this thing will travel once we launch it out of our rocket.
Right.
We don't have that kind of specificity.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, do you think that this area is kind of in a field to where it can never be that way? Or do you think at some point in the future, probably not so close, but that can be a physics of approach that we will know, or it'll always have that sort of got to test it out vagueness because it's just too complex?
Yeah, I think I'm optimistic enough to think that it would be super cool and maybe possible for us to get to a place like that, right? Like if we really just hunker down, the problem is we have too many things that are interesting. And if we're going to do this, we have to like pick a couple and just put our heads down and do that work to really figure it all out, right? But that's not, I mean, just to peel back the curtain a little bit, that's not how our world really works, right? Like I am rewarded for doing totally new, original stuff no one's ever thought of before. When really, I think science would be a little better off if we were like, hey, everyone, we're going to spend 30 years trying to figure out how to get people to brush their teeth.
Yeah.
And like, once we do that, we'll have like this grand model of all these pieces that are at play, and that's going to inform all sorts of other stuff. But I think it's hard to like really get down to that narrow specificity. But, you know, at the same time, I also think there's an air of randomness that's always going to be part of it. If you run the same simulation of the world a dozen times, it's not going to go exactly the same, right? There's a bunch of stuff that you just really can never account for. But, you know, cross your fingers. Hopefully that becomes a smaller and smaller piece of the pie as you look further into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the machine learning, AI, big data stuff would be very critical in a process of being able to have any of that be more easily mapped just when there is so much complexity. I've had a couple guests on recently talking about how they're using that for predicting behavior, and you can do predictive eye tracking based on what other people have done. I mean, just amazing stuff. So I think there's a mix of all these things coming together to make things like that happen.
It's tricky because the big data stuff is helpful because you're able to just like have all the pieces that you never thought were relevant. But you also run into this problem that like, if I have all the pieces, I can be too easily wooed by something that actually doesn't matter, right? Like it's sort of by accident mattered in this one observation, but it doesn't actually matter.
Right.
And so you do run the risk of chasing stuff that isn't relevant if you have too much to account for.
Right. And it would be arrogant to think that you actually got everything.
Yeah, well, sure.
And so there's that like false sense of confidence and security that comes in something like that. So lots of things to be worked out, but that's what makes it a fun time to be in the field, right?
Totally. Yep.
Yeah. Well, as we are getting sort of close to closing out the show, what is something that you wish I would have asked, or something that you just love to talk about, or a big focus for you? Now's the time. Share something else that I didn't even know to ask.
Sure. Yeah, goodness, what a question.
I
mean, the thing that comes to mind is I spend a lot of time working on this idea of attitude strength, right? So in addition, I guess to one step backward from that is when we think about persuasion, people have different implicit ideas of what our goal is. Like, what are we trying to persuade people of? From my vantage point, it's opinion related, right? Like persuasion is about changing your evaluation of something, right? So just to get as like technical and boring about it as possible, right? Like an evaluation, an attitude is just, I see something and is my reaction positive or negative, right? Ultimately, that's what an opinion boils down to, right? Like, oh, I like Life cereal. What that means is I have a little positive sticker and I put it on Life cereal in my brain, right? Or I go, I don't like broccoli, which is a lie, but imagine, right? I see broccoli, I have a little negative sticker and I stick it on broccoli in my brain. And persuasion is about altering that, right? So if I go, how can I get you to like broccoli, right? How can I get you to take off the negative sticker and put a positive one on instead? And so that's a lot of what persuasion is. Now, some people really are more interested in behavior. They're like, I don't actually care if you like broccoli. I just want you to eat it, which is fine. It's just a slightly different version of persuasion. But if we stick with that evaluation component, we often, I think, get into this trap of thinking that like, oh, opinions are just one thing, right? You have an opinion and we maybe agree or we disagree, but there are a bunch of different layers underneath those opinions that are related to the strength of it, right? And so you might see two people who would on the surface look like they're in perfect agreement, but are actually totally different. Like maybe one person is 100% willing to shed that opinion for another one. And the other person goes, I will never, ever, ever reverse my view on this. And that's essentially what we mean by a strong opinion, is one that people say, I will not change it. And it will be the thing that guides the decisions I make, right? So if we think about product attitudes, right? If I have intense loyalty to some brand, right? I not only like it, but you can't convince me it's bad. And I'm going to spend my money on that brand over other brands, right? That's a strong opinion. And so I think a lot of persuasion research could start to look at not only how do we get you to like this brand, but how do I get you to have a strong opinion about my brand, right? How can I get you to be like an advocate for my brand? Go out and tell other people about it. If we screw up, at least temporarily, how do I get you to stick with us until we can sort things out? And so this is this domain of attitude strength, right? How do we get people to be confident, unconflicted, see this as an important part of their identity? That to me, I think is a layer that people don't always appreciate in persuasion if you're just focused on changing a mind, period. But that actually turns out to have a huge impact on how we talk about our opinions.
Yeah. So the ultimate question on there, knowing that theory is more in the space that you are versus applied, is there some sort of a tip for the brands out there for getting to have more of those strong opinion advocates for them, like a place to start or what they should be looking at, maybe to find people who are already advocates of theirs, things like that?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things come to mind. One is it's still sort of new in terms of the work that's being done on it, but identity-related attitudes, right? Some people call them self-defining attitudes, right? This is an opinion that really is like about who I am. And are there ways that you could take your product or brand and make it self-relevant, right? Like it's not just coffee. It's like me. That's who I am, right? This is part of my day. It's part of who I am to consume this product, right? And so once it gets attached to my sense of self, it's a little harder to shatter later. And the other is if you think about like where confidence comes from, one place confidence comes from is consensus, for better or worse, right? If I look out at the world and I at least seem to think most people hold this opinion, I become confident in it, right? Sometimes we think about social proof as a way of changing minds, but it's just as important a tool as getting people to commit to something they already believe, right? So sure, you're already on my team. You already are buying my product. I want it to be clear that you're not alone, right? That you're part of a community of people who all have agreed that this is something that's worthwhile. And that could be enough to help stoke some confidence in it through that consensus.
Love that. I will, of course, be linking to the interview I recently did with Robert Cialdini, or I guess, like I said, Bob yes. Cialdini. Now that I have the permission, where, any of that persuasion and influence stuff, we can't have a conversation about it and not link him into it at some point. So that'll be in here. So thank you so much for sharing that and about being self-relevant. So this is part of me and who I am, an identity piece versus just, I like that cereal versus like, I eat Cocoa Puffs.
Yeah, I am Cocoa Puffs.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. The I am. And for me, it would be like Kate Spade, one of my brands, right? I love Kate Spade. But that can still change, as we say, I'm more of the river approach than a fixed person. So we'll see.
And everything is relative, but it at least makes it less likely that you would jump ship as quickly, right? Because you go, ooh, wait, for me to totally do a 180 on that means that maybe I'm wrong about myself. And that's much more uncomfortable. So I would rather just kind of hold on to things for a little bit until I can be convinced otherwise, which also means that as a persuasion strategy, one of the things you can do is chip away at these strength things first, right? So I go, maybe I'm not going to get you to totally reverse your position, but maybe I can get you to sort of distance yourself from this thing or get you to doubt this thing or realize actually there are people who don't think this way. That may not change your mind right now, but it sets the stage for change later, right? So you can reverse this, right? How do I get people on my side versus how do I get people away from that side? Strength is an important part of that equation too, I think.
Yeah, it's a long game for a lot of these, and there can be some priming in your messaging or something now that we're looking down the line of getting someone, like you said, chipping away at that to where when the time comes in your selling process that they're ready to be more likely to be open to the change conversation when you're looking to persuade them way down the line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's just an interesting aside. I don't know why this came to mind, but speaking of the identity relevant thing, one of the interesting ways that people have looked at persuasion is through self-affirmation. I don't know if this is a familiar thing, but if I can basically remind you that you're a good person, let's just get it out of the way. You're a good person. You have values that are important, right? You do things that help people. Now, all of a sudden, people get less defensive, right? Because sometimes people go, well, I can't be wrong about this thing. How could I have loved this thing for so long and now it's like bad? Like now I'm defensive about it. And in some ways, that kind of reminds me of that chipping away thing, which is to say, let me first remind you, you are all great, all on your own. And also, this thing that you've believed, I don't know that it's really true, or I don't really think it's the best product out there. Now all of a sudden you go, oh, I'm now able to let go of this because I'm not gripping onto it as tightly because I'm not using it to fulfill this sense of being a good person.
Yeah. One of my favorite sort of, I guess it would be, I'm trying to think of the right word of, totally escaping me, but not a proverb, but something in that realm, to which is you are perfect with room for improvement. Like we are all perfect and like, tomorrow's another day. Like we can do something to be perfect then too. So as we now officially close out the show, for everyone who I know is so interested in your work and what you are looking into and they want to hear more from you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So academically, my website is andyluttrell.com, where you can find the research and stuff that me and my lab have done in the past and ongoing. But that can get a little technical. So to look at these things from another perspective, I also host a show called Opinion Science, which is a podcast that comes out bi-weekly, mostly featuring interviews with other social scientists who study our opinions, where they come from and how they change, occasionally doing deeper dives into bigger topics like dissonance or contact hypothesis that bring lots of perspectives together. And then other times talking to professionals who do work applying these things, but maybe not from a scientific angle. So the one that always comes to mind is I talked to a film critic about how she approaches reviewing films and talking about them to the public, a political campaign manager about how you actually do that kind of stuff. So I think it's sort of lots of different ways of getting at this question of what are our opinions? Where do they come from? And why are they so important? When can they change? So implications for politics, for brands, etc. So you can find more about that at opinionsciencepodcast.com or any of the podcast places or on the social medias at OpinionsSciPod.
Perfect. Well, we will definitely have links to the podcast, to your website, to the socials. They'll all be in the show notes waiting for everyone. And I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Andy Luttrell, for joining me on the show today. It's been a joy chatting with you.
Sure thing. Super fun.
Thank you again to Dr. Andy Luttrell for joining me on the show today. What got your brain buzzing in today's conversation? For me, I'm always fascinated by how confident we can feel in our opinions, even when they're based on little more than gut instinct or a fleeting thought. Andy's insights on moral conviction and the illusion of understanding are such important reminders that our beliefs aren't always as solid as they seem. And that's not always a bad thing. It's actually an invitation to stay curious, to check our assumptions, and to open the door for meaningful dialogue and change. This is a great setup for the next episode of the show, my chat with Laurier Mandan, where we'll explore how brands tap into identity, meaning, and desire, those very same forces that shape and solidify our opinions. If you aren't already subscribed to the Brainy Business podcast, now is a great time to do so to ensure you don't miss that or any other episode. So now I'm curious, what opinion have you changed your mind about recently? Or what's one you've never questioned? come share it with me on social media. You'll find me as the Brainy Biz pretty much everywhere and as Melina Palmer on LinkedIn. There are links in the show notes to make it easy, as well as links to my top related past episodes and books, ways to get in touch with Andy and myself, and more. It's all waiting for you in the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/534. And thank you again to Dr. Andy Luttrell for joining me on the show today. It was a delight to chat with and learn from you. Join me next time for my conversation with Laurier Mandan to discuss his book, I Need That. It's going to be a lot of fun. You don't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.